Now, I've had a few folks ask me about the term smart supply chain business intelligence and why it's different. Well, what SMART means is having business intelligence that adds value in the right places and at the right levels within your company. So in essence, it's a solution that works for you to help keep your business healthy and move it forward. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Now, a good starting point in our discussion around smart supply chain BI is how far solutions have come over the past number of years. So if any of you has done a bit of exploration into this area over the past decade, you most likely know what I'm talking about. BI used to be a tool for relatively large companies that needed to churn through large amounts of data. Now, they typically had statisticians and analysts on staff who were tasked with culling through mounds and mounds of information to look for trends, and then they were tasked with developing custom algorithms and predictive models so that their company could help keep a competitive advantage. Now, this was a pretty expensive undertaking, and most times it was out of reach for mid-market and smaller companies. I can remember one smaller company I consulted for a little over a decade ago. Now, they briefly flirted with BI, but they quickly realized that the cost of the tool available at the time and the additional staff needed to make real use of it was actually more than what they had paid for the new back office system they had just rolled out. Now, I'll talk more about this company and a few others in a bit. But for now, let's fast forward to present day. As you can see on the slide, BI is far more available and feasible today for companies of all sizes. The advent of better software architecture, data storage, access, and also data manipulation and modeling is creating what many are calling a sort of leveling of the playing field for business. Now, this has me personally delighted, as it will help smaller and middle market companies become more competitive and ultimately keep everyone on their toes. It makes for much stronger market competition and creates a lot more opportunities for success. But let's go ahead and stop here for a quick poll. We would like to know how you are measuring your supply chain performance today.
Answer A, Excel spreadsheets received 44% of the votes. Answer B, ERP analytics received 14%. Answer C, we have a BI solution received 17%. And answer D, we don't measure performance, received 25%.
All right. Very interesting results, but actually pretty well in line with what I've seen and what the market trends tend to be right now as well relative to BI. So let's go ahead and continue on. So now that it's feasible to implement, let's spend a few minutes walking through how best to get there and what BI can deliver for you. Now, the important thing about BI, as with any other strategic project, is to maintain a good amount of focus on the three pillars of business operations. That would be people, process, and tools. I know that we all know this, but the challenge is not allowing any one of these pillars to play a role of any of the other or to supersede another in importance. You know, this is the people, process, and tools model is a well-known model touted by a number of leading business consultants. But the challenge is when new technology is introduced, whether it be progressive or downright disruptive, it tends to give all of us cause for pause as we try to sort out what it means for our respective companies. Oftentimes, and has been the case with BI, the technology ends up being expected to play a role beyond what it was built for. And when it understandably isn't capable of delivering, things just don't go well. So there was a company about 15 years ago that was more than $1 million into a new system and had to abandon it. The costly flaw in their planning ended up being too much focus on the technical part of the solution, the tools. They concentrated on the actual moving of feeds and systems and on the process of technical implementation. When we looked at where things went off course, we found that there were too many presumptions with having the right people in place and in leveraging the right processes for getting value from the BI solution. There wasn't what some would call a BI audit performed, where they could understand the company's actual need for business intelligence. So the solution was purchased with the expectation that it would magically fix or enhance the current BI efforts. Now, had they taken a brief step back, they would have been able to avoid the cost and the noise of a number of meaningless reports, and also the new solution candy store menu, which added a number of new reports that didn't deliver much extra benefit. As I mentioned, they ended up walking away from the tool and writing off the cost because back in those days, modifications and tailorings were more like setting concrete than soft clay, and it was going to be more expensive for them to fix what was there than to wait, reevaluate, and start over in the future. So with this in mind, I've gone ahead and broken the steps to Smart BI out into two categories: knowing what you can and should measure, and understanding your company's goals and what is achievable. Now, this isn't anything revelatory by any shape of the imagination. The key to success is maintaining an appropriate level of scope and the right amount of discipline in the project. When this happens, BI can deliver a great deal of value to your company in the areas of cost savings, customer loyalty, and a healthier, more efficient supply chain that you can turn into a competitive advantage. So, let's dive a little into the first part of the BI audit, knowing what you can and should measure. Every business has BI in one form or another. Basic financial reports are part of BI, sales reports are a part of BI, customer satisfaction ratings are a part of BI, inventory turns are a part of BI, and there are a host of others. If you've been in business for a while, you've learned probably by trial and error some of the KPIs that are most important to the health and growth of your company. Some other things you measure may not be as beneficial as you thought they were, either because your business has evolved since you established them, or because they measured activity and not outcome. During a BI audit, you can evaluate what you're measuring and the value those measurements actually bring to the organization. So let's focus on KPIs for a few moments. Strong, accurate KPIs are critical to purchasing and implementing a BI tool that delivers competitive value. So here are 4 things to keep in mind. First, measuring activity in some areas is necessary to drive quick business performance improvements and prevent long-term challenges. I'll talk about this a little more in the next slide. Second, measuring achievements is beneficial. However, achievement for achievement's sake often becomes a checkbox exercise rather than a metric that is truly relevant to the business. Now, a mid-sized company I worked with a few years ago allowed each department to set up their own measurements based on what they thought they could safely achieve and, in a sense, look good. Unfortunately, a number of these department set achievements have little to no relevancy or impact on corporate strategy or growth. I likened it to a salesperson wanting to measure him or herself by being at their desk at 8 a.m. sharp every morning, and not by meeting quota or doing other activities that drove revenue, customer satisfaction, or customer retention. Now, the third area is relevancy and future health measurements, and this is the most important measurement for KPI and ultimately for business intelligence. This is where I've seen a number of uses for BI fail. The reason is that this is typically where you will need to commit some sort of financial investment beyond technology. Activity and achievement measurements are reactive and have typically been handled by existing resources in the organization, even if they were handled manually. Establishing forward-thinking measurements requires looking at some industry best practices and either engaging with outside resources or ensuring that skill set is on staff one way or another. Now, this can often be done either through a staff ad or training a talented resource already on board. The most important thing is that the end game is to understand and plan for the metrics that will drive your desired business outcomes in today's world and for the next couple of years. Now, the fourth point, and one area of caution to be aware of, is the emergence, and actually I'd call it the explosion of big data. We live in a data-driven world. Systems are built to rapidly capture, transform, and move data from point to point. But with it can come a great deal of white noise. The company I mentioned a little earlier, the one with the department established metrics, was also too focused on data for data's sake. There were data gurus on staff that churned through a great deal of data to identify mathematical correlations. However, many of their findings ended up being red herrings. There was a lot of time and labor hours wasted, and some decisions were made on the wrong measurements as a result. Now, we ended up establishing a degree of relevancy process aligned with the business plan that quickly filtered out issues that were either completely innocuous or had very little impact relative to other more critical metrics. Now, with all that said, How do you know what to look for in a BI audit and what changes you should make? Well, the key is to right-size the scope of what you're measuring. On the prior slide, I outlined 3 types of measurements: activity, achievement, and relevancy and future health. You should be able to group your existing metrics into these categories. Now, it won't be a perfect exercise as there are relationships across all 3 types, but it will help to get a snapshot of the metrics that are there for metrics' sake and those that are there to help drive business outcomes. For example, you can look at your activity measurements and identify if they are an indicator of achievements. You can look at your achievement measurements and identify if they are relevant to the business performance needed to support your corporate strategy and your business plan. Now, as you get into this part of the process, it's good to keep in mind some of the causes of metrics that don't do more than expend time and resources to be measured. On the slide, I've identified some of the pitfalls and causes I've seen in my work with BI in companies of various sizes over the past number of years. The first obstacle is focusing on volume and activity rather than outcome. Example number 1, dials versus deals, is obviously a sales metric. A company I consulted for reported to the home office on a regular basis the number of dials each salesperson made as evidence they were working hard and helping to contribute to sales goals. Now, the problem was that sales weren't increasing at all. In fact, they were declining. The focus was on repetitive activity rather than actions that moved to the desired outcome, which in this case was new orders. By reworking and measuring progression through the sales stages, we were able to use BI to identify the areas that really needed addressing. Some of them were strategic, and then things improved. Now, it's not that the number of dials isn't important. I think we all know that at some point, sales becomes a numbers game. The issue was that the simple measured activity didn't produce scalable results that drove beneficial outcomes. Going from 50 dials a day to 100 didn't improve sales, and it actually caused more problems in the pipeline. In the other examples here, the activities measured were all important, but they weren't tied to scalable positive outcomes. The number of times a PO was touched, or an item was transferred, or a delivery notification was made did not play much, if any, role in landed cost, inventory turns, or customer satisfaction. There were other activities that had a greater, more directly correlated impact on the business drivers being measured. Now, the second obstacle I'll talk about, relative to right-sizing the scope of what you're measuring, deals with transparency across locations, divisions, and even business units. This most obvious area here would be like or similar resources and activities. For example, a retail chain operated on a mildly federated model for the majority of its business practices. Through an acquisition, it ended up with store locations that were a few miles apart. Now, the stores used completely separate processes for procurement, ranging from landscaping to large capital equipment. Once they looked across business silos for similar activities, they realized very quickly that each location paid significantly different amounts from the same suppliers. Getting their pricing standardized improved margin almost immediately. Now, the last obstacle is heading down the slippery slope of measuring because you can rather than because it adds value. Now, I've seen this happen during implementation at companies that had historically manual BI processes, or those that didn't regularly revisit their BI strategy and program. What happens is all of a sudden technology is there to make things so much easier and faster, and the temptation is to look at and measure everything, including the kitchen sink. This is where it's good to have access to the company's 3 to 5 year business plan if you don't already, so you can identify the true drivers of the plan and avoid, as I've said before, measuring for measurement's sake. Again, it should be relevant and focused on what will move your company into the future. And to do that, you're going to need a little help from the top. Buy-in at upper levels. One very critical factor for successfully implementing BI, and more importantly, making it smart, is having some sort of leadership visibility across the supply chain and ultimately your company. BI simply works best when it is focused beyond department or siloed initiatives. This allows a broader set of performance metrics and the resulting impact to be measured and analyzed. Now, at this point, I think we'll go ahead and stop for another quick poll to find out who's leading your supply chain.
The question was, does your company have a single supply chain leader? Answer A, yes, our head of procurement got 13% of the votes. Answer B, yes, our head of finance got 3%. Yes, our head of supply chain got 42%. And no, our supply chain leadership is fragmented across functions, got 42% as well.
All right. Okay, so it looks like this particular group is definitely heading more towards the trend of having supply chain personnel, dedicated supply chain people. That's great news. Okay, so back to BI real quickly. A few years ago, for some, the supply chain BI initiatives may have been handled by a functional department head who led the project and periodically interacted with his or her peers, such as a VP or director of procurement working with a counterpart in finance. Or it could have been handled by somebody from maybe a project management department in your company that went around, gathered requirements, and managed the implementation. Now, this worked well for a while, but as the supply chain has grown more mature and sophisticated, it's become increasingly important for companies to focus a position or positions on the supply chain as an end-to-end entity in and of itself. This forces organizations to optimize operations to a larger, more strategic benefit that supports the overall health of the business. Now, an appropriately empowered position from this area, staffed by someone who has a clear understanding of building and maintaining a strong, healthy supply chain, as well as the critical factors of how the supply chain supports the company's business plan, is ideal for driving BI to be successful. If you'd like to know more, you can download our free educational ebook on supply chain evangelists from the Handouts tab in the webinar control panel. Now, once this person or persons are identified, it will be much easier to develop an overall plan and set it up for the best chance for success. So let's move on to the second part of the BI audit, understanding your company's BI goals and what is achievable. Now, one of the most beneficial questions you can ask at this stage is why and how is BI important to my company? What quantifiable value does it actually deliver? Now, the question's easy, but getting to the answer can often be more challenging. Why? Because companies often get into routines and do things simply because they're supposed to. Actions become instinctive and programmed rather than deliberate and value-driven. Like I mentioned earlier, we all live in a data-driven world. Quantity is no longer the challenge. It's relevancy and quality. So take a moment and think about your Facebook or Twitter feed. You have friends, friends of friends, news outlets, political organizations, retail companies, and a host of other sources, all pushing information at you constantly. But what do you regularly use Facebook or Twitter for? What value do each of these communication tools deliver to you? Did you use them differently at first and then scale back? Did you follow a bunch of companies and people and then begin to unfollow and filter over time? Or did you just treat it as surface noise and now find that you're not enjoying your news feeds nearly as much because they're so cluttered? Well, companies can end up behaving the same way as individuals in this respect. It's important to look around a bit and understand what your company really wants to achieve with BI. So one of the things I've encouraged folks to do at this point is, interestingly enough, to become 3-year-olds. Now, I'm joking a little bit here, but in other words, what I do is I encourage them to ask why. It's not that a full-blown question everything session is needed, but stopping to ask why are we measuring this and to quantify or prove out the answer goes a long way in understanding where your company is at and if it needs to shift its perspective on BI. It's important during this process to take these answers or objectives and tie them back to your company's overall business drivers and business plan. Each objective should be clearly tied to initiatives that move your business forward. If it doesn't fit that criteria, I'd recommend using careful evaluation as to how much it's really needed and how much effort and expense should be put forth towards it. On the slide, I've included some objectives companies can have for using BI. One thing to keep in mind is how the activities associated with these objectives can originate in one functional area but impact others. For example, let's look at internal operations performance. A company I worked with was having issues with expedited freight from its trading partners. They worked in a high-volume industry with decreasing margins, so fluctuations in freight charges were a big deal. We studied 100 shipments with expedited freight over a 90-day period and noticed a common characteristic across the orders. Whenever there was a less than 1 week time span between a change order and a required by date on a PO, it was highly probable that expedited freight charges would be incurred. Knowing this, we were able to understand what was driving the need for the late hour changes to the orders. We made some procedural changes that reduced the expedites, but still helped to meet the manufacturing and delivery deadlines. Now, this tied nicely back to two corporate objectives the company had. The first was maintaining and growing customer satisfaction, and the second was protecting margin. Now, I also have a quick example of asking why, where the result was to reduce measured metrics. This one focuses on relationship building with customers. Now, a colleague of mine worked for a company that sold a mid-range personal electronic device. They were heavily into customer feedback and measured satisfaction frequently. The issue was they were measuring a little too frequently. Approximately 30% of their measurements had no positive impact on customer satisfaction and actually made the company seem a little too eager and unsure about the quality and value of its product. Asking why and then validating the answer helped them to reduce costs and also touch their customers at the right cadence. So the net here really is that asking why and then proving out the answer can go a long way in right-sizing your BI, like we covered earlier. It also helps to set the stage for managing expectations and managing to the desired outcome of successfully executing on the business plan. So, I've covered a lot. How does all this fit together? You know how your company perceives and uses BI. You know what you need to measure and why it's important. And you've aligned things with your business plan. Now what? This is another important area that can end up making or breaking your BI implementation and the success of your company's adoption. It's very important to roll a new BI initiative out in stages. This will allow you to transform from your existing BI data gathering and analysis to the new solution in a minimally disruptive process. Just like you want to minimize the number of variables and risk when you roll out other projects and systems, you want to keep as many things static as possible, especially during the early phases of a new BI solution. One of the things I wrote in a recent blog post was to first migrate your existing BI activities to the new solution, and then give everyone time to get used to it. From there, you'll be in a much better position to create a BI roadmap, so to speak, so it can be designed to give you the right amount of actionable insights at each stage. This is where the 2 to 3 year planning horizon is beneficial. It essentially forces additional alignment between BI and your business plan and helps to prevent BI from becoming a tactical activity. For example, the company I spoke of at the beginning of the presentation, the one that didn't implement BI at the time because of the expense involved, they did implement a solution once price and total cost of ownership were affordable. They took a disciplined approach to minimize variables and risk. They first moved their basic financial scorecard to the system. That helped them to solidify all the information and roll of metrics from AP and AR and overall finance that fed the financial reports. They were also able to determine the level of information drill down they needed when they were doing historical analyses, and also for real-time review, so how to get to more granular information when they were looking at possible anomalies at higher level metrics. After the basic rollout, they began integrating other departments and tying all agreed metrics to KPIs on a larger dashboard. All of this was based on what the company needed in the short term for the first 12 months. Now, at the same time, they also began planning for their BI needs based on the company's 5-year business plan. Plans for new markets, services, products, and partnerships were going to drive additional and different KPIs. They didn't need to implement them currently, but they did need to be prepared for them at the right time. Implementing BI with this methodology helped to keep the investment in line with the value, and it also helped them to select a solution that would allow them to grow and change their use of BI over time without incurring a higher total cost of ownership. So what happened when they were done? Well, I'm not able to show their actual information, but here's a presentable example of one of the first things we found once finance and procurement metrics have been implemented and studied. The first thing we did was to look at cost of goods sold by customer rather than by finished goods product line. This gave us insight into the percentage of revenue invested in each customer at any given time. Now we noticed they were holding the equivalent of 7.5% of their annual revenue in finished goods inventory for a single customer. Now that's not uncommon in their industry. However, and here's where BI came into play very quickly, we were also able to identify that another 7.5% of their annual revenue was being held in raw materials for that same customer. That meant they had the equivalent of 15% of annual revenue tied up in a single customer and not 7.5% as previously thought. This painted a very different picture, especially when the customer in question was beginning to struggle financially. We were able to elevate the issue to the C-level and to the VP of Sales and recommended some policy changes in the process. So as a result, we capped the amount of raw materials on hand for any customer at 3.75% of revenue and put warnings at 1% and 2% in the system. This allowed for more visibility across the board and also helped finance, understandably, to breathe a little bit easier. Now, one small thing it did, and I say that very tongue-in-cheek, was to have a positive short-term impact on gross margin. Reworking the customer raw materials stock policy produced a 3% increase in margin within 90 days. Now, the CEO said the system paid for itself nearly 100 times over with this single piece of insight. Now, again, this is just a brief example. One additional benefit we did enjoy during the process was the speed at which we were able to get to and evaluate the information we needed. We were able to spend the majority of our time working the problem, not gathering the data. And that brings me to my last point, which deals more with the benefits beyond the actual dashboards. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that a smart BI solution adds value in the right places and at the right levels within your company. That in essence, it's a solution that works for you to help keep your business healthy and move it forward. Having a well thought out and implemented BI solution that can grow with you over time does more than serve up information at your fingertips. It frees key staff to be more proactive in problem solving and more strategic in how they look at the business. Now, the information on the prior slide that helped the company increase its margin as well as minimize financial risk, it was there all the time. What BI did was to take much of the labor and focus out of the data gathering process so thought could be given to the areas of improvement and potential areas of risk. This has never been more important in the supply chain than today. Now, there are some examples of supply chain BI benefits up on the screen, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. The overarching benefit is the ability to see and measure what is relevant and to have time and bandwidth for the best response, whether that be, for example, avoiding potentially disastrous disruptions or working to strengthen your overall trading partner network and customer base. Now, at this point, we'd like to show you an example of one BI solution to give you an idea of what to expect and look for as you evaluate what you might need moving forward. Now, I've asked Joe Harris, our product line manager, to briefly walk through the business intelligence dashboards we provide in our supply chain management solution, OneSCM. Joe's been with Take Supply Chain for about 8 years and specifically oversees the dashboard solution. So I'll turn things over to Joe now.
Thank you, Donna. When we look at OneSCM, we have to understand that there's really two domains when you're accessing OneSCM. First, you have the buy side, which deals with the purchasing, the PO acknowledgments, the advanced shipment notifications, and the accounts payable invoices. Then you have the sales side, which involves sales orders, shipping orders, accounts receivable, invoicing. Now, OneSCM is this big network that pulls both of these domains together, so it's really the perfect layer to apply to business intelligence dashboards. Now, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I'm going to log into OneSCM, and we were able to partner with MicroStrategy, one of the leaders in business intelligence. So when I access the dashboard, we OEM their solution into our product to where you can actually see the dashboards and display it with the full functionality that's available with MicroStrategy. Now, one of the things that we did with the dashboards is we broke up the dashboards that you see into different functional areas. So the modules that you're licensed for within OneSCM, you'll be able to have access to the different tabs within the dashboards. On the left side of the screen, we apply different filters against the dashboard that's visible. So if I wanted to view the dashboard results for the year 2014, I could easily select that filter and see the amounts, the PO counts, the PO changes, and supplier changes on this dashboard. Another standard feature that we have across all of our dashboards is this export to PDF option. So I've filtered this dashboard and I want to take this to a meeting. So I can take this, export it to PDF, and print it. It remembers the filter changes that you've made on your dashboard, so it's easy to take with you outside of our product. We go ahead and filter back to all years. Another thing that MicroStrategy provides is the ability to have one graph target another object on the dashboard. So I want to see all the purchase orders that make up this November category. So November 2014, we have a grid at the bottom that shows all the purchase orders that make up that November category. So you can use one graph or chart to actually target a different chart. Another thing that we provide the ability for is for dials to have thresholds. So some customers, when you look at PO changes, 25% of your POs coming into OneSCM is, it's a high number of change volume. So we can adjust this for individual customers. So if I have this green set to 25%, yellow set up to 75%, and red set up to 75 to 100%, I can update that for individual customers. So we could set the green up to 10%, the yellow from 10% to 80%, et cetera, on these dials. So that threshold being able to be applied for each individual customer is a really neat feature. Now on the purchasing tab, we're just going to look at our standard metrics based on purchasing. So you have the PO amount, which looks at your landed cost of orders that you've created. And then the PO count is the volume of purchase orders that are coming in and out of the system. For shipping and receiving, we're going to look at the total received quantity broken by monthly buckets, as well as our accepted and rejected receipt count if you actually inspect those items once they're received at the receiving dock. And then we also have the ASN count. So what's the volume of ASNs that are being sent from our suppliers? For our invoicing tab, we look at a lot of similar metrics that we do for the purchasing tab. So we've got the total invoice amount, average invoice amount, our total volume of invoices, and then a graph of monthly buckets for the average and total invoice amount. Another thing that we look at, so any invoice that's failed in the system, it could be a three-way match fail, it could be a processing fail. So any invoices that failed has a dial that shows that failed percentage there. And again, each of these dashboards can be filtered by the filter bar on the left side of the dashboard. And notice that the thresholds on this graph are different than the thresholds that I applied on the purchasing graph. In the supplier performance, we're really looking at the average time for a supplier to actually acknowledge a purchase order. When they actually acknowledge, what's their status? Are they accepting all the lines or schedules on that purchase order, or are they not acknowledging those lines, or they're rejecting them? Another thing we look at is the accepted and rejected receipt quantity. So that's one of the charts that we had on the shipping and receiving tab, but it makes sense to pull that over to a supplier performance tab as well. Another thing that we look at is our on-time delivery from promise date and on-time delivery from required date. Since those are two metrics that we can actually pull from the purchase order and validate based on the receipt time that receipt has occurred for that PO, we can look at that and evaluate that in monthly buckets in our sales demo system. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation back over to Donna.
All right, thanks, Joe, and thanks for a good presentation. I'll close out with a little plug for my company to make our sales folks happy, and also just in case you might have some initiatives to improve your supply chain operations. So real quickly, as you can see on the screen, we here at Take Supply Chain offer both software and services to help companies get to better performing supply chains end to end. So that would be everything from receiving a sales order to purchasing from suppliers to producing your products to delivering them to your end customer. Now, we do handle the majority of the work for you related to planning, implementation, and rollout, and we also onboard, train, and support your customers and your trading partners. So it does end up being a pretty affordable and valuable solution. If you want to know more, please email me at the address on the next screen, and I can put you in touch with one of our sales consultants. So